And actually, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Oh, Christ is risen. Yes. But as they joke in America, Christ is risen, but the priest is dead. That's how I feel sometimes.
Take a moment, get you. Take a moment if you want to get your notes.
Yes, look, I need a couple. Not a couple of minutes, but less than that. Just to get myself out.
Shadow was so used, she dropped off. Shadow was so used, she dropped off.
I'll just get myself crossing.
What's he going to do?
I've got no idea. Probably a glass of water or something. It's delayed, is it?
I could have gotten that. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
All right, sponsor. Okay. Right. What are we at? It's really right. Okay. All right. So, well, first of all, the prayer. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. And how's that hitting? Is it? It's
not.
It's not what?
I didn't switch it on, did you?
I turn it on. Yeah, I turned it on, but that maybe it won't be hot because I've been running around sitting up. That's why I feel a bit hot now, but it might be okay later. All right, so we've got the following topics tonight. First of all, I'll comment on the Sundays of Pentecost. Then we've got a couple of passages from the Gospel, the Transfiguration and healing of the lunatic boy. Now, I really have to rush because it's, again, quite a hefty piece of material. So let's go. All right. So beginning with, of course, the Sunday of Holy Pascha itself and Bright Week. And I'll just mention some liturgical features of this week. Now, my apologies for those for whom what I'm saying might seem a little bit esoteric, but look, I think it's simple enough for most people to relate to in terms of the liturgical material. So, well, in the week in Bright Week, beginning with Sunday of Pascha itself, there's no reading of Psalms. Actually, that stops even before Pascha, except for the 6 Psalms. But there's no reading of the priest's prayer. You see, this is something that a lot of people may not be aware of, that at the beginning of Vespers and at the beginning of Matins, the priest reads a set of prayers. There are 7 of them at Vespers and 12 at Matins during the reading of the 6 Psalms. There's 12. But because they're connected with the normal material of Vespers, like the Psalm 103, and the Matins prayers are connected with the 6 Psalms, and they have, these prayers have strong penitent sort of thoughts. So this is why it's considered inappropriate to read them during Bright Week. The Matins at Pascha and Bright Week has no polyaleos. Now that's how do I quickly explain what that's about? Well, polyaleos means much mercy. Okay, it's the it refers to the Psalms, the refrain in one of the Psalms at the beginning of Matins when it says, "For His mercy endureth forever," and that's a refrain. So that's not sung. There's no. That's another Greek word, megalinarion. Now, megalinarion is the magnification, or veličanje in Slavonic. For any saints or feast, there is no reading of the Gospel at Matins and no singing of the doxology at the end of Matins. That's quite a different service. The hours compline and midnight office have one simple format of material taken essentially from Matins, and it's all sung, and it's all very short. And as a matter of fact, maybe some people don't know, as I better mention, during Bright Week, instead of the usual morning and evening prayers, what you're supposed to do is just say, well, you can sing them if you like, but reading is fine. Those hours, okay? So that's all for morning and evening prayers. And also, of course, we do not say the prayer, O Heavenly King, from Pascha until the Vespers of Pentecost, which is one of the stichira at those Vespers. Okay, most of the Paschal material was written by an 8th century great saint, a great liturgist, the great hymnographer, St. John of Damascus. John of Damascus is greatly respected in the East and in the West as well, because he wrote the first systematic theology, dogmatic theology. It's called the exact exposition of the Orthodox faith. It goes for, well, so it's a whole book. And all subsequent textbooks of theology are really based on that. So that's 8th century. Now, the 8th century and the beginning of 9th was a very creative period in the history of the church, because on the one hand, the church was suffering in the East, not in the West. It was very peaceful in the West. But in the East, it was in great turmoil because the Byzantine emperors were trying to eradicate icons, the use of icons, iconoclasts. And the church faithful, especially the monastics, stood up to the challenge, and a lot of materials produced. And St. John of Damascus, he wrote important stuff himself in support of iconography, or icon veneration, I should say, the theology of the icon. He wrote about that because theology of the icon is very important. All right, so that's St. John of Damascus. He uses the theology and theological poetry of a number of earlier saints, hundreds of years before him, especially people like St. Gregory, Bishop of Nazianzus in Asia Minor, in Cappadocia, Eastern Turkey now, who's the lifelong friend of St. Basil, and also a great theologian, the younger brother of St. Basil, another Gregory, Gregory of Nyssa, Bishop of Nyssa. I suspect that he approaches St. Gregory theologian in his theological, gifts. A very great man. A little bit sort of overwhelmed by his older brother when St. Basil was alive. That's what happens, sibling kind of not there was no rivalry, but the younger brother certainly respected his older brother, and it prevented him from coming out with some of the best stuff that he wrote afterwards. All right, so that's all used by St. John of Damascus. So what I'm saying is that the Paschal material is taken by him from the earlier fathers. Now, royal doors are open in Bright Week for the whole week, signifying the opening of heaven, which was inaccessible to anyone before Christ's death and resurrection. Okay. Now, something that must have been quite astounding. Just a little over 100 years ago, before the Bolshevik Revolution, in countries that are now known as Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus, which at that time was, Russian Empire, they follow the practice of continuous bell ringing whole week, all of Bright Week. The bells in the cities did not stop ringing. Can you imagine? With literally hundreds of churches in a place like Moscow, and that is for a whole week, wherever you went, you were never away from bell ringing. And I remember an interesting incident when we were building this church here, and I had a sort of a PR meeting with some of the locals who live in the area at that time. It was in the 90s. So I invited them in. The church was, it was just brick and mortar and not much else inside. And they were asking me all of these questions. And someone timidly asked about the bell tower. Says, "Oh, you've got the bell tower." I was a little bit concerned that we were walking into a minefield here, because I thought, well, maybe these people won't like bell ringing or something. So I started gently talking about it. Yes, we do use bells, blah, 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 blah. And I said, as a matter of fact, we have this custom that during Bright Week, anybody can come and ring the bells. And they said, "Oh, can we ring them too?" I said, "Yes, of course." So anyway, but they've probably forgotten about it. Anyway, because it took quite a few years before we got to any services. So that's the bells. Yes. There are actually many descriptions of Western European tourists who came to places like Moscow and Kiev to listen, to just participate in this grand symphony of Easter. It was, out everywhere. but especially, of course, around and inside the churches. Okay. And some European tourists would make the trip, especially for that, to just because they'd heard these reports about this amazing experience of the symphony. All right. Yes, another thing, this is now during the communist atheistic regime. Of course, I think I've given you statistics of how fierce the persecutions and oppression of the church was. That from 55,000 churches before the revolution, only 400 remained open over the whole expanse of that former empire by 1939. So that's not a lot. It's less than 1% remained open. And so what happened was, of course, services still happen in those churches that were open, and people were drawn, those who were afraid to attend church normally because, you attend church, the NKVD or the KGB will say you, and, you got a good job, forget it, Charlie, you're going to lose it. If you want to christen your kids, the priest has to show the baptismal books regularly to the KGB. Okay, so you have to be really, really courageous or do things secretly, which a lot did. Even party members sometimes. I know actual cases of Communist Party members being nagged by their wives and especially mothers-in-law to christen their kids secretly, because they didn't write it into any book. But look, I'm getting carried away. But I'm talking about the spectacle of Easter. Even during the grim times, grim from religious point of view in the Soviet Union, because there was so much restrictive and pressure. People were drawn like moths to the light for that night, and the police, with the aid of volunteers, these hefty guys, would try and block out people from coming too close to the procession, and that were big crowds, and young people always tried to break through, sneak through, and they would be carried away. I know this happened. So that was the powerful, the power of Christ's resurrection. All right. Okay, so that's just fragmentary stuff on about Bright Week and Easter itself. St. Thomas Sunday. It's also called Antipascha. Now the word or prefix anti in Greek means not only against, but it's also instead of. That's why, for instance, Antichrist is not only against Christ, he is instead of Christ. So Antipascha means like instead of Pascha. It's a celebration done in more usual terms liturgically. That's Saturday night and Sunday. St. Thomas, who actually in the Roman Catholic Church is seen as the patron of empirical science. I love that because he's the one who said, until I see and touch, I will not believe. And so that's Thomas, one of the 12, doubting Thomas. Okay, but the church in its services actually praises Thomas because his doubt was not negative. He wanted to believe, but as the Lord meekly sort of reprimanded him, he said, Thomas, you believe because you've seen. More blessed are those who believe without seeing. Okay. And the service of St. Thomas Sunday emphasizes the reality of Christ's bodily resurrection. He was not a ghost, not a spirit. So the Typicon allows customary commemoration of the dead from Monday after St. Thomas. And so the Eastern Slavs have developed this tradition, which is called Radonitsa. That's like the joyous day. It's joy for the dead, the resurrection, right? And so it's going to the cemeteries. In our practice here in Victoria, we start going on actually on the Sunday, on St. Thomas Sunday in the afternoon itself. And from then on to the cemeteries in a systematic way. Now, the third Sunday is the Sunday of the myrrh bearers. So 7 are mentioned by name in the Gospels. And we got Mary Magdalene, who's the first out of the women. Of course, church tradition holds it, but of course, the Lord appeared to his mother first, who was pained so much by his crucifixion. But Mary Magdalene, Mary, wife of Cleopas, is the man who walked to Emmaus together with Luke. So they were there 2 of the 70. Joanna, Martha, and Mary, sisters of Lazarus. We got Susanna and Salome. As I said, 7. But there were many other women who the Gospel tells us served the Lord and his disciples from their prosperity. They were rather well-to-do people. Also on that day, we remember Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who were members of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council and the internal government of the Jewish nation during the time of the Romans. They had fairly wide autonomy, except they could not carry out capital punishments. They had to refer those to the Romans. Yes, so these 2 men and the women illustrate to us the words of St. John, St. John the theologian, in his first letter, talking about love that drives out fear. All right. The 4th Sunday is the paralytic. Well, that's the one that was last week, and that begins an important. There's an important shift from the topic and the theme of the resurrection, and then now we turn to the topic of water. Water that I'll explain in a minute, more precisely, what this symbol of water means. But on Sunday of the Paralytic, Christian anthropology, of course, speaks of the paralyzed human nature, the human nature paralyzed by sin, that we are unable to do the works of God without Christ's healing. Right, now, mid-Pentecost is the Wednesday after the Sunday of the Paralytic, and this is where the symbolism of the water becomes apparent. And the symbolism and stories associated with water continue. Paralytic, the Samaritan woman, and the last one, the blind man. So mid-Pentecost remembers the story of Christ coming to the temple to teach about his mission and the mystical water of his teaching and the grace of the Holy Spirit. Okay. Now, it wasn't by accident that the Lord chose to talk about water on that occasion, because there was an Old Testament rite of this feast where on the last day of the feast, the high priest would come out of the temple, and the whole area was full of crowds, huge crowds of people, right? So he would walk down to the spring of Siloam with a golden cup. He would scoop water out of the spring and go back to the temple. In the meantime, all of these thousands of people would be singing what is called the Great Hallel, the Great Hallelujah, Psalms 112 to 117, continuously, without ceasing, in booming voices. So it must have been a very powerful scene. The Levites would also play the trumpets. So the priest bring the water, add wine to it, and then pour it out into the sacrificial altar. Can you now see a prototype, an archetype? So sacrificial altar. What was this about? It was an image of the ultimate sacrifice of Christ himself. Blood and water, okay, flowing from the wound of Christ when he is pierced by the lance. So wine and water in there, right? Okay, now today we had the Sunday of the Samaritan woman, and so we've discussed this story in our earlier studies, so I won't go into that with any detail. And today in the sermon, I emphasized that she had, despite her sinfulness, she had that inner truthfulness, which enabled her to repent immediately. Wow, that's really a wonderful story. And traditionally, her name has been preserved as Marta Fotini in Greek. Phos photos in Greek means light. Okay, so that name has been translated into Slavic languages as Svetlana. Okay, and that's what it means, because Fotini from lights, Svet is light in Slavic languages. So the Lord has an amazingly long conversation with this woman at the well, which in itself was just revolutionary, because in Jewish culture, and the culture of the whole Middle East, for centuries after that, well, certainly at that time, a man and a woman who did not know each other could not speak unless they were together with other people and in the context of married couples, friends and whatever. And so he speaks to her by herself, and so the apostles are quite surprised. They don't even know how to behave themselves You know, they're sort of standing there timidly and wondering, you know, what's going on? Why is he doing it? But it just shows Christ's amazing love, you know, and respect for not only men, but you know, women to him are human beings, which they weren't in the ancient world. You know, they were second class. It was awful. It's through Christianity, through Christian teaching, through the gospel that women began to, you know, feel more sort of liberated and became active in the church and so on. So yeah, it teaches her about true worshippers worshiping in spirit and truth. That's a big topic, so I can't really begin that now. I did not check my notes from that past session when we actually handled the Samaritan woman, but I guess I should have covered this topic of spirit and truth. Anyway, the last Sunday is the Sunday of the blind man, the sixth Sunday of Easter. So he's born blind, and the disciples asked the Lord, what is the reason? Why was he born blind? Was because of his sins or his sins of his parents? And he says, neither. But this is for the glory of God. Because the transformation that we see in this man, in this story, is just quite amazing. Becomes a really courageous witness for Christ, a true confessor. Powerful story. It's coming up next week. Well, born blind, it's again touches on Christian anthropology that without Christ, we are blind. Only he can give us back the spiritual vision that Adam had before the fall. The 18th century saint Tikhon, Bishop of Zadonsk, writes, what darkness is for our bodily eyes, sin is for the soul. Yes, and of course, on Wednesday of that week, which is so not this coming week, but the week after next Sunday, on Wednesday, we have the last day of the feast. It's called the Apodosis of Easter. So it's basically a service quite like the services of Bright Week, which is, you know, the only time outside of Bright Week that services like that, just focused entirely on the resurrection. Right. All right, so now we go to the text of Transfiguration. Good. So that's Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 13. Mark, where are we? Chapter 9. Yes. All right. So now, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His clothes became shining, exceedingly white, like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." Suddenly, when they had looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. Yes. Now, as they came down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things that they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, saying, "Who do the scribes say that Elijah must, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Then he answered us and told them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things. And how it is written concerning the Son of Man, that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt. But I say to you that Elijah has already come, and they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written of him." All right, so there's quite a bit to say about all that. So the timing of the event is determined with precision. It was 6 days after Peter's confession of Christ as the Son of the living God, which we looked at before. Now, Luke, I forgot to mention that all of the three synoptics describe this event, Holy Transfiguration. Luke says he gives 8 days, but that's clear why, because he includes the day of their journey and the last day, the day after. So that's why you get 8 days of Luke. Name. The mountain is not named. The mountain is not named in the gospel, but a very ancient church tradition has it. It was Mount Tabor, which is around a large hill, mountain in a flat plain in Galilee. It's very unusual. When you go there, you do have a look at it. Go up there. There are 2 churches there. There's a Roman Catholic Church, an old one, and the Orthodox Church. And one of the annual great miracles of God happens there on the night of the 18th to the 19th of August, the old calendar celebration of the Holy Transfiguration. The cloud, the shining cloud, it comes on the mountain, just like it did in the gospel story. And the pilgrims come and observe it. So Jesus Christ takes 3 of his closest disciples, this Peter, James, and John, to reinforce their faith. Now, their faith in Christ proclaimed and confessed just so recently by Peter, but we know that his faith would be severely shaken. Yes, this was needed in view of the approaching passion of Christ. As the Kontakion of the feast describes, that this was the reason that Kontakion, which is a hymn placed after the 6th ode of the canon of a feast, or any canon actually, it really gives a rather deep analysis of the meaning of the feast. if you look at the Kentucky. The The Troparion of dismissal at the end of Vespers is more descriptive, but the Kontakion further into the service at Matins is deeper. And that Kontakion speaks about the reason why Christ did this, took them there, so that they would be fortified. They would, when they saw his passion and death, they would not be shaken. But they were shaken. I mean, retrospectively, of course, they put two and two together. According to Luke, and we read it only in Mark just now, Jesus Christ ascended the mountain to pray, and his transfiguration occurred during prayer. The evangelists describe the transfiguration in the following manner. The first, Matthew and Mark state the fact. He transfigured before them. Then they describe the transformation of his face. Luke writes, the appearance of his face was altered. Matthew writes, his face shone like the sun. Then they describe the change in appearance of his clothing. So Matthew writes, his clothes became as white as the light. And Luke writes, his robe became white and glistening. Mark does not mention the look of Christ's face, but he goes into more detail about the clothes. And we just heard that his clothes became shining, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. Next, the disciples beheld another wonder, the appearance of Moses and Elijah in glory. They stood before Christ as his servants. So there, in iconography, they are over there, Transfiguration, on both sides of Christ. Maybe turn the camera around, Chris, just on position. Let's see if it's visible. Higher up. Yep. Yes, that's the one. Okay, a bit higher. Good. Okay, enough. Right. So they stood on both sides of Christ, and they could be observed by the apostles who were slightly lower down. Moses and Elijah conversed with the Lord, and only Luke mentions that what the conversation was about. He writes, they spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Okay, so they spoke about his death. Church tradition has it that this event occurred 6 weeks and 40 days before the Passion. And liturgically, the timing of this, the celebration of this feast was established once the 4th century Feast of the Holy Cross, that date was established for 14th of September. Okay, so, well, you know, if you add 13 days for the compensation of the calendars and that, so it becomes 27, and 6 weeks earlier is the 19th, the 6th or the 19th of August. It's 40 days. So that, yeah, that celebration of the Holy Cross was established once the great church of the Holy Sepulchre was completed in the year 330 AD. Was begun by Saint Helen, the mother of Constantine, the emperor, Roman emperor. the church thought it would be inappropriate to have such a big celebration right at the beginning of Lent, 6 weeks before Pascha. So that's why the church used the reference point of another celebration of the cross and placed the feast of Holy Transfiguration in 6 weeks relationship to it. All right. In second letter of Peter, chapter 1, verses 16 and 18, we read, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty, for he received from God the Father honor and glory when such a voice came to him from the excellent glory. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we heard this voice which came from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain." Second letter of Peter. All right. How did the disciples recognize Moses and Elijah? Possibly from the words that they said to the Lord, to Jesus Christ, from the way they looked, because they were traditional sort of portraits, like, as it were, a mental image of how Moses looked and how Elijah looked, what they wore and what they looked like. This is how iconography preserves, this imagery. Okay, and in iconography, Moses always holds the book of the law. There he is. He is on our right of Christ, and Elijah on our left. Okay, on Christ's right. Yes, it's like iconography, the face, the beard, everything was preserved in popular memory, even though hundreds of years had passed since that time. So what was the purpose of their appearance? It was to show that they spoke to Jesus Christ as their master. They behaved like his servants. Thus, he was not like one of the prophets, how people thought. Remember the beginning of the story of Peter's confession? The Lord asked them and said, "Who do people think I am?" And they said, "Well, some of them think that you're one of the prophets," etc. Well, he was certainly not one of the prophets, because the greatest two of the prophets were serving. The lawgiver Moses is called a mediator by Paul in Galatians chapter 3. But even he humbles himself before the ultimate mediator between God and man, the God-man Jesus Christ, as we will again read in chapter 3, Galatians. Moses and Elijah were representatives of the living and those who died, because, of course, Elijah was taken alive in the body, in the untransformed body like ours. It's just taken out of time. And despite the fact that now 3,000 years have passed, for him it's like 1 second. No time. He does not feel time, and his body doesn't feel it. It boggles the mind. All right. Yes. So they're also representatives of the law and the prophets. This is the way that the scriptures were referred to we hear that expression coming from the law and the prophets. They were representatives of the souls who awaited the coming Savior. From describing Christ and his prophets, the evangelist turns to the description of the state of the apostles. Matthew and Mark report the words of Peter concerning the three tabernacles. Why on earth would he say, let's put up three tabernacles, tents? Tabernacle is it's a Latin word. Tabernaculum means tent in Latin. So let's put up three tents. Why tents? Well, Peter was in ecstasy. The three of them experienced this state like as close as we can experience in this body what heaven is about, the experience of heaven. And he comes out with these words. Why? Because, tabernacles represented that closeness that Israel had in the wilderness at the time of Moses. They were living in tabernacles. And it was one of the feasts celebrated each year. And the Jews celebrate it to this day. They build little tents in the backyard and live there for a week to celebrate the time of Moses. So this is why Peter talks about three tabernacles. Now, Luke mentions just before this that they were heavy with sleep, and when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Clearly, they were awakened by the bright light of the Transfiguration. It was a long journey, and they were very tired, and they fell asleep while the Lord was praying. So the chronology of the events seems to proceed in the following fashion. First, the mountain is ascended late at night, and Luke mentioned that it was early in the next day that they came down the mountain. Secondly, the apostles were very tired and fell asleep while Christ prayed. Thirdly, when the light began to shine, they came out of their sleep and watched the whole event fully awake. Luke mentions that Peter began to speak about the three tabernacles when the prophets were parting from him. So they were sort of like beginning to disappear. It is as if Peter will say, "Oh no, don't go away. Just stay there. Let's build three tents. Stay. May this moment never stop. This is what heaven is like. It's an experience of joyous timelessness." And suddenly, these prophets begin to move away. So, oh no. Okay. The three. The three disciples, they experienced heaven. They were not afraid. Even though we heard from Mark that they were afraid, but really it was a kind of a trembling, a joyous trembling, then which turned to a different kind of fear with the coming of the cloud and the voice of God the Father. So Peter comes out with words that are childlike and naive. Very simple. And in iconography, Peter is shown at that moment. The other two are shown in the next moment. They've fallen down and in fear. So iconography often shows different time frames, and not infrequently, iconography can have anachronisms, like in the icon of the protection of the Mother of God. It has the scene from early 9th century with a superimposed the deacon Romanus, the melodist, who's from the 6th century in that same service. Because, the glorified state has no time. The cloud and the light overshadows them, and they heard the booming voice of God the Father. This is my beloved Son, in whom I will please hear him. This bright cloud is exactly like the so-called Shekhinah of Exodus, a visible sign of God's presence. The cloud looked like a normal cloud during the day, and it shone at night over the tabernacle, the great tabernacle, the portable temple. Hear him were words of Moses concerning the prophet like him that God would send. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 18. Moses' last speech to the people. He says, God is going to send another prophet like me. Hear him, listen to him. And it's fulfilled in Jesus. Luke mentions that the Lord was by himself when God the Father spoke. Mark mentions the suddenness of the disappearance of the two prophets. So why was it necessary for the two prophets to disappear? So that the apostles would clearly get the message that the words, my beloved Son, applied only to Jesus Christ, not to Moses, not to Elijah. Because when these words were heard, the two prophets weren't there. It was clear to them who the beloved Son was. Because it's hard for us to imagine how Moses-centered that culture was. And, this is why the difficulty later, when the apostles began to, especially Paul, began to talk about Jesus Christ as, the new lawgiver of grace and that. What about Moses? What are we going to do with Moses? Okay, well, nothing. Moses stays. He's the Sabbath stays, and the Sabbath is a holy day for the church. Has been for the last 2,000 years. But there's a greater day as well. We have to really race now. It's already 8:01. The Lord's conversation with Peter, James, and John during the ascent off the mountain. Now, Luke mentions that the three were quiet about their experience, clearly because of Christ's instructions to keep quiet about it. Luke does not mention the subject of Elijah coming before the Christ. Mark mentions that Jesus Christ told the three to keep quiet until he rises from the dead. The disciples were wondering what it meant that he would rise from the dead. The Messiah was supposed to not die at all, according to the tradition. Okay, he was supposed to stay forever. So in John chapter 12, we have heard from the law that Christ remains forever. And how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man? Remember that conversation? It's when Christ spoke to the multitudes in the final days before the Passion. Now, the disciples did not ask about his resurrection. However, but the scribes say that Elijah had to come beforehand. In reality, they, of course, wanted answers to two questions. The first was concerning his resurrection, and the second about Elijah's coming. So, indeed, the Lord answers both questions. Matthew expounds the answer in some detail. I quote here from Matthew. That's chapter 17. But I say to you that Elijah has come already, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. It is interesting that Christ's answer begins in a way that is timeless, not connected with the events around the Baptist. He says it in the present tense. He says, indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. So that he did not use the past tense. This statement is above the level of simple chronology. Yes, John the Baptist was sent to prepare the way for the Lord. Possibly this statement is a reference to Elijah's coming before the second coming, because there is a church tradition that, and we see in the book of Revelation mention of two witnesses who had appeared, and the church interpreted that those two witnesses are the two people who have not experienced death. Enoch and Elijah. They will come to preach at the time of Antichrist, to warn people not to believe him, and they will be actually killed by him. All right. I think what we'll do is we'll probably leave the second topic for next time. It seems to be difficult to put so much material into 1 hour. I think I was a little bit over ambitious trying to cover all the Sundays of Pentecost first, and then all this material. Now, the Transfiguration, of course, is a very important story, and we needed to look at it in some detail. So, yeah, we'll save the healing of the lunatic boy for next time. It's not such a big thing, but we'll need another 10 minutes or so. Yeah, so do we have any questions? No. Okay. All right. In that case, any questions from among the those here present? All right. Okay, where are we? Shine. Where's shine? Oh yes, I see. Yes, you've opened up the from the literature. Okay, so we say the prayer which I couldn't. I didn't have the text in front of me last time, but here we are. We've got it. I know it in Slavonic, not in English. Shine on you, Jerusalem, for the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. Thence now be glad, O Zion, and do thou exalt the pure Theotokos in the rising of him whom thou didst bear. Thank you all, and see now. I have to we have to discuss the next date, because in a fortnight's time, I have a problem. Most of the clergy from the diocese will be congregating in Brisbane to celebrate the centenary of the Brisbane parish, which was founded in 1923. So that will include me, and at this time I'll be at the airport on my catching a flight back to Melbourne, God willing.
Do it on your mobile. Do it on your mobile. I'll dial you in.
Yeah, our operator suggests that I can do it from the airport on the mobile, but I think that's a bit too drastic. So I think we'll have to. So what will happen? Oh, we've got problems because the following Sunday is Pentecost. What are we going to do? Well, I really, really need to put my thinking cap on. Anyhow, look, our secretary Costa will write to you, and can I suggest that those who are not on our database, on the mailing list, Chris, can everybody clearly see how to get on it? All right. Yes, just make sure that you stay informed. I'll have to decide what to do. Who knows? Maybe I'll take this notes to the Brisbane airport. Well,
send Brisbane a postcard. Send Brisbane a postcard. Wish you well staying here.
All right. Okay. Anyway, look, life will go on, and we'll pick it up one way or another. So, all the best to you, and wait for